Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. It is my pleasure to welcome you all as we continue to explore the Catskills with a lecture and Q&A session with Professor Lauren Strauss and the film director, Les Gillespie. I hope you all enjoyed the film, whether it brought back memories or exposed you to a fascinating time in American Jewish history. I enjoyed seeing all the images and hearing the stories, and look forward to continuing to learn with our speakers this evening. Thank you to Bobby and Mike Goldman for sponsoring this program. Thank you also to Andrew R. Ammerman for sponsoring our Spring 2024 lecture series. He dedicates the semester's learning in loving memory of Josephine H. Max and Stephen C. Ammerman. We have a number of excellent programs coming up this fall, from exploring musicians of Vienna, such as Brahms and Mahler, which is next week, by the way, to Jewish-Christian interactions in the Talmud, to the psychology of religious beliefs. There's something for everyone. Check out our website to register and to find more information on sponsoring a program. As usual, ask questions using the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. Please be as concise as possible and use complete sentences. Questions will be discussed following the lecture, but feel free to write them in at any time during the presentation. Les Gillespie is a 3-time Peabody Award-winning public radio journalist turned filmmaker. The Catskills is his second film. His first, The Mambonics, explored the Mambo craze of the 1950s. His features for public radio expose dangerous jobs in garment factories on the US-Mexico border, chronicled the return of the sacred Blue Lake to the Taos Pueblo in New Mexico, and told the story of a hip-hop opera set in a Korean mom-and-pop corner store. Dr. Lauren Strauss teaches Jewish history and Israel studies at the American University in Washington, D.C., where she also serves as the Director of Undergraduate Studies for the Jewish Studies program. A scholar of American Jewish political and cultural history, her forthcoming book is Painting the Town Red: Jewish Visual Artists, Yiddish Culture, and Radical Politics in Interwar New York. Her next book explores political activism in the DC Jewish community in the 20th century. Dr. Strauss lectures widely and is a commentator at Jewish cultural events and in the press. She is active in shared society groups and academic organizations in the US and Israel, and she has curated and served as a historian for several museum exhibits. With that, I now welcome Professor Strauss to join us on the screen as we delve further into the Catskills. Welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Right. Hello, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Matt. Thank you to the Haberman Institute and to Andrew Ammerman and the Goldmans, the various sponsors, and all my friends there. It's good to kind of see you. Well, I can't see you, but I know you're out there. So this is, I have to say, during a sort of a dark period in politics and American Jewish life, this subject really brings a lot of joy. And I have already had a number of people say to me, oh, how fun, you're talking about the Catskills. It's not all light, as you will see, but it really is a breath of fresh air. And especially today, September 11th, it's actually, I think, meaningful to talk about something that's so positive and reaffirming. So it's really quite interesting how a phenomenon that is now going on its second century has endured and is experiencing a revival in many ways. Just last week, my husband and I are making our way through seasons of Ted Lasso, So if you've seen the whole thing, don't give me any spoiler alerts. And Ted Lasso is an American in England coaching a British soccer, or of course, as they say, football team. And among his players, there is a young man who's from Nigeria. Okay. Ted Lasso asks them a trivia question, and this guy from Nigeria pipes up with an answer, the Catskills. And Ted Lasso, the coach, says to him, "How do you know about the Catskills?" And he says, "Oh, I watch Mrs. Maisel." And this is from, I think this episode was filmed in 2022. So here we have an absolutely contemporary TV show about an American non-Jewish soccer coach in England coaching a young man from Nigeria. And he asks a trivia question, and this guy comes up with the answer, the Catskills. And in that case, it is due to the popularity, of course, of the TV show, Mrs. Maisel. But you see these references, like when your antennae are up and looking for it, there are references to the Catskills all over the place, either overt ones like that, or ones that people don't necessarily realize that they're making. For instance, when people discuss the rise of really the creation of stand-up comedy in America. And when you talk about the roots of stand-up comedy, you're talking about the Catskills, or really, I should say, the Borscht Belt. The homepage of the Catskills Institute, which is a very fun website, says it very well. Quote, "New Yorkers hungry for mountain air, good food, and the American way of leisure came to the mountains by the thousands. And by the 1950s, more than 1 million people each year inhabited the summer world of bungalow colonies, summer camps, and small hotels. These institutions shaped American Jewish culture, enabling Jews to become more American while at the same time introducing the American public to immigrant Jewish culture." So that sums it up really nicely. That is from Phil Brown, who is really the premier historian of the Catskills. So what are the Catskill Mountains? Where are they? They're approximately 125 miles northwest of Manhattan. So they're in New York State. They're not quite upstate New York, but of course, Manhattanites think of them that way. And they were dubbed the Catskills by the Dutch explorers of the New World. You have the name kill in a lot of Dutch name, think Peekskill, Fishkill, etc. So this New York state mountain range that is sort of a paradise for Native American tribes, and is then colonized and settled by white Protestant immigrants who work as fishermen and leather tanners, et cetera, and farmers, starts in the latter half of the 19th century to cater to wealthy white Anglo-Saxon Protestant blue blood people from the area, from New York and Connecticut, who can afford to make this noun into a verb, to summer in the mountains, which are hard to reach at that point. There's no train line that goes right there. And this is immortalized, this period of time is immortalized in the work of the 19th century paintings of the Hudson River School artists. So I'm going to share my screen, hopefully, and show you some of this. Okay. I am screen sharing, it tells me. Come on. There we go. All right, so here we have an example of the early visions of the Catskills. And even though the natural surroundings would really remain very similar, I don't need to tell you that the inhabitants of the area would change quite a bit again by the early 20th century. So how did this sort of paradise, this kind of WASP paradise, by the end of the 19th century, become best known as the Jewish Alps? There are several fun nicknames: the Jewish Alps, the Catskills, in imitating the East European accents of people who would go there, and its most famous nickname, which references, of all things, a Russian beet soup, which of course is borscht, the Borscht Belt. So let's start not at the beginning of the height of the Catskills, but at the end, or a little past the end of their height. So almost everyone I know in my generation can quote a certain line at the end of a certain movie, a low budget movie that has sort of gone down in history, whether or not people have seen the whole movie, where Patrick Swayze plays the bad boy dance instructor, Johnny Castle. And of course, I am talking about Dirty Dancing. And in the 1987 low budget film Dirty Dancing, Johnny Castle, very non-Jewish local boy dance instructor, swaggers over to the corner where his recent paramour is sitting with her doctor father and fancy mother. And what does he say? And I wish we were in person, because I'm sure that the whole room in unison would tell me that what he says is exactly the line that's on top there. Nobody puts baby in a corner, because poor Jennifer Grey has the unfortunate nickname Baby. And this would go down in history. Now, she's a privileged good girl who has just had her first romance, her first sexual experience with Johnny. But when people fell in love with this movie, did they really know the layers of history and sociology that lay behind the summer romance, set in the fictional but oh so realistic Hotel Kellerman's in 1963? So, with its Jewish family ownership, complete with bratty, entitled grandson of the owner, its clientele made up of upper middle class New Yorkers like Baby's parents, Dr. and Mrs. Hausman, the sexually hungry wives of gamblers and factory owners, who many of the women are single during the week while their husbands are at work, and who only come up on the weekends, and this seemingly bumbling, clearly Jewish older couple who turn out to be shrewd pickpockets. The bottom line here is that all the clientele shown are clearly supposed to be Jewish, or they're coded Jewish, as some people say when talking about movies. And then you have the also very realistic gaping chasm between the clientele and the hotel staff, and the different types of hotel staff. You have, on the one hand, the clean-cut college boys who are serving as bellhops and waiters, future doctors and lawyers who were practically commanded to woo visiting girls by both management and the girls' parents. And on the other hand, the locals, epitomized by Johnny Castle and his friends, the non-Jewish white working class instructors, lifeguards, drivers. And then after World War II, where this movie takes place, the addition of some local ethnic color. So on the dance floor, we have Latino dance instructors, or people pretending to be Latino, and we have the beginning of a Black staff presence in by the end of the 1950s, really the beginning of the 1960s. How many people, though, watching this movie in their 20s and 30s, when this film came out, knew what it was to fress or gorge themselves from the unlimited menu at the vast Concord Hotel dining room, or to ski down the hill at Grossinger's, or to the Little Hill, or to sneak into the nightclubs and casinos to watch the grown-ups in their glittering attire, or to rough it hiking in the mountains and getting stuck in the middle of a lake in a paddle boat. And yes, I'm speaking from experience there. Ask my sister. As the fictional hotel owner, Mr. Kellerman in the movie, says to his Black/Latin band leader, who asks him in Yiddish, the Black Latin band leader asking him in Yiddish how he's doing. Mr. Kellerman answers in the film, the only Yiddish really in the film, frag nicht, don't ask. And why? Why is he saying that? Because they already see the writing on the wall at this point, set in 1963, that this scene is not going to last forever. With the advent of jet plane travel, people are jetting off to farther locales for their vacations, etc. But just to show you that I'm not only a historian, but I not only play one on TV, but I am legit when it comes to schmoozing about the Catskills. I did experience some of that when I was very little. My family did go to various locales and especially resorts in the Catskills in the end of the golden age there in the 1970s. We did stay at the Concord, Grossinger's, Kutcher's, the Nevele, etc. And as you'll see, we have connections with a lot of the different levels that you find there. So here you have, put this in for my family. Here, the little curly one is me. Surprise, surprise, right? Here you have my family, my parents and my sister and my grandparents dressing for dinner at the Concord, and then here a couple of years later. So I have my Catskills credential. But what does it mean when we talk about the Jewish Catskills, only part of which was known as the Borscht Belt, or it was only known as the Borscht Belt for part of its time. Historians of the region have designated two great ages of Catskills sort of hospitality industry. The first they have named, they've designated the Silver Age. And that is the kind of post-Civil War WASP era initial growth of these hotels that are meant to be the height of luxury and have sort of a whiff of Europe. They are supposed to evoke mountain resorts and spas in places like Marienbad, and other places in Austria and Germany and especially in Central Europe. And we even see here that in these idyllic paintings of the Catskills hotels at the time, you see here the Flagler Hotel is evoking Spanish architecture. So they're very au courant. They're very aware of being seen as following the height of the architectural trends at a given time. So what happened? What happened? How did it become the Jewish Alps from this period? Well, at the end of the 19th century, the waves of Jewish immigration, especially from Eastern Europe, they were still coming from Central Europe, from Germany, Austria, Czech Republic, what would become the Czech Republic, was still Austro-Hungary, but really, the tidal wave of immigrants began coming from Russia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, countries like that. And from the early 1880s until really the close of immigration at all into this country in the 1920s, with the Johnson-Reed Bill exactly 100 years ago, in 1924, about 2.5 million Jews came to this country. Now, to give you some perspective, before this period of mass migration, before the Civil War in the 1850s, there were about 150,000 Jews in the whole country. At the beginning of the 1880s, there were about 250,000, many of them, or most of them on the East Coast, but a certain percentage of the German and Central European immigrants living already in the Midwest. So this number jumps in this 40-year period of mass migration from 250,000 approximately to almost 3 million, to about 2.75 million. And as these people are coming, they are overwhelming certain neighborhoods, especially the Lower East Side of New York. They are working almost entirely in the garment industry and in other forms of light industry, in factories, and especially in sweatshops. And there is overcrowding to a degree that is not seen anywhere on the globe, nowhere else. The late 19th century well-known photographer Jacob Riis put it this way. He said, if you compare the Lower East Side, especially the Jewish wards, the Jewish neighborhoods of the Lower East Side of New York, with Calcutta and Bombay, the New York areas would compare unfavorably with those areas. That's how crowded they were. Tuberculosis was a scourge. Hundreds of thousands of people were exposed to it. And when the train lines started to be built further and further into the mountains and were more accessible to this immigrant population as they started to work their way up and out and leave the Lower East Side and move to Brooklyn, to Brownsville, to Williamsburg, go to Coney Island, which had been restricted, no Jews in most places in Coney Island, even in the 1870s. They wanted to get farther away from the city on their weekends and especially in the summer. So this was the attraction of the Catskills for them, that it was accessible. It's not that far, even then, with the trains, and they could get there. They could reach the mountains and the mountain air. Problem though, the people who own these older hotels and many of the people who lived full-time in that area did not want to be overwhelmed by a bunch of Yiddish-speaking, garlic-cooking, loud immigrant Jews, and they were very clear about it. They did things like advertise the safe hotels, the safe institutions up there, like this Hotel Lawrence at the end of the 19th century or the early 20th century, where they say, oh, it accommodates 100 people, it's 20 minutes from the railroad station, they have their own transportation, they even have a telephone, so this is our early 20th century, etc. No bar, no consumptives, that means people with tuberculosis, and no Hebrews, which is frankly what Jews called themselves also until for a very long period of time, until the birth of the 20th century. They referred to themselves, was considered more genteel to call themselves Hebrews or Israelites. No Hebrews, you're safe here. You don't need to run into that type. So what did some enterprising Jewish immigrants do themselves? They recognized that their brethren wanted to get out of, here with the slide of a tenement house by the aforementioned Jacob Riis, that they wanted to get out of there. So with a little bit of money, some of these immigrants started to go and open boarding houses. They were not opening anything close to what the Concord became, anything like that yet for a while. But there were inns and there were boarding houses and smaller institutions as well. And by the 1920s and 30s, really spread very quickly, faster than tuberculosis. The majority of hotels and really buildings in this area of the counties that would make up the Catskills, Dutchess County, etc. The majority are either large inns or much smaller houses owned and visited by Jewish boarders, Jewish people who stayed for a weekend, a week, or the whole summer. So they had places like this. Okay, so this is in the 20s. This is Glenmore Inn, Glenmore Hotel, which was, this is in mid-expansion, actually. It started out being much smaller than this. And so in sort of contravention to the advertisement that I showed you, that's the No Hebrews, they had their own signs. They would put up advertisements that said, strictly kosher, or dietary laws observed. A little more subtle, but those who know, and they knew, and they came. And so they, some of the Jews actually started out saying under Hebrew management, but then that became illegal within the first few decades. And whereas the non-Jewish ones would counter with close to area churches. So there was this sort of subtle war of the billboards. By World War II, there were no legal restrictions on accepting or not accepting a religious minority, but as we know, of course, there were many informal restrictions as well. So I talked about these poor and working class immigrants. They're maybe moving from the sweatshop to a proper factory, maybe to their own business, but they still don't have a lot of money. So the resorts are still in the future. They came and they not only stayed in these very nice inns and smaller houses, but they stayed in also very, very small establishments that became known in the area as the bungalow. And you might call them cabins, you might call them small houses, but when you are talking about the Catskills, you talk about a bungalow. These are restored ones because one interesting phenomenon that I learned researching this is how many of the remaining ones, most of them are not still in existence, have become very desirable, partly because of the recent kind of small house movement, and partly because of real estate, and people want to be able to have an escape in the mountains just like they used to. So they are renovating. But these bungalows, you don't have one bungalow. What do you have? Bungalow cries out for another word following it. And that word, of course, is colony. We'll have bungalow colonies. And so these immigrant Jews would come in groups, not only with the families, but with other people from their neighborhoods, or maybe cousins from a different part of Brooklyn or from a different part of New York, maybe from the Bronx. And they would go and they would reunite and spend the summer together in these bungalow colonies. Political groups, political sort of compatriots would also come to the bungalow colonies. And so you would have different colonies that developed characters that were either known for specific political persuasions. You had Bundists, so those who belonged to the Yiddish-speaking labor movement, the large labor movement, the Bund. You had, of course, communist bungalow colonies. You had Yiddish culture, Yiddish poets going and all staying in the same bungalow colonies. And of course, you had extended families and other kinds of groups as well. How did people sort of exist there? Well, there were two models. One was what was called a kuchelein. And I learned this a long time ago from my father. who grew up in Brownsville, Brooklyn, and his family did not have very much money, but whatever they had, they would go up and visit the Catskills. In later years, when he was growing up, they even were able to buy a car or share a car, and sometimes even drive to the Catskills. But they stayed in a kuchelein. What is a kuchelein? And it's a Yiddish word that means cook for yourself. Not self-cooking. You're not cooking alone. You're cooking for yourself, as opposed to staying in a hotel or a resort where somebody is cooking for you. And here is an example of a kuchelein. And you see here what many interviewees refer to as a matriarchy running this little colony, because, as I mentioned before, in many cases, the men would stay in the city or in Brooklyn, wherever they lived, working during the week. And during the summer, the mothers would come up with the kids and spend, if they could, a month or longer there. And they would either each have a kind of rudimentary cooking apparatus in their little bungalow, or there would be a shared one, and they would all cook together in this shared kitchen, kind of a combination of shtetl and kibbutz. And the kids, what did the kids do while all of the mothers were there and the fathers were sometimes there and sometimes not? The kids, from what I know from memoirs and interviewing people, the kids were in paradise, essentially. They got to run around. They had the older kids watching the younger kids. They tell all kinds of stories about having no privacy, absolutely no privacy. Parents and children often sleeping in the same room, sharing bathrooms with several families, etc., but spending their days hiking or swimming in the lake, picking berries, running around, playing hide and seek. As the resorts were built, trying to sneak into the resorts and trying to use their facilities, and on rainy days playing cards inside and generally making trouble, and then after the rain stopped, going out to hunt for salamanders. Sounds pretty perfect. One family reminisced that once the kids turned 10, okay, get this, 10 years old, they were permitted to hitchhike into the neighboring town of Monticello. Their mother, the person writes in the memoir, would wave goodbye as they climbed into strangers' cars. Okay, you can unpack that with your therapist later. But on Saturday nights, the adults went out. Nobody got a babysitter. The kids were all with each other, the older kids watching the younger ones. They remember playing kissing games, sneaking cigarettes, etc. And for many people say the same thing. We will all tell you that it was, quote, the best time of our lives. For adults, the bungalow colony was an extension of, and also a break from, their crowded lives in the Bronx and Brooklyn and increasingly Queens and some other places. But the women really ruled the roost. So in the 1950s, before the advent of air conditioning, this was the kind of vacation that they would take. This I alluded to this earlier. This, for instance, is my father's family. This very proud Brooklyn boy is my father. And his brothers and his parents, and they just were so thrilled to get out of the city. They also tried to sneak into resorts. Sometimes they were successful, and they had an interesting awakening, shall we say, some of them, especially his older brother, with some of the local girls and other girls staying in the bungalow colony. So what about the famous hotels, though? The famous hotels that is, if you've heard about the Catskills, this is what you've heard about. But I really wanted to start by underlining the fact that there are so many levels to the society there. So the famous hotels started out as some of these smaller inns, but pretty soon, even in the 1930s, you had innovators like the one and only Jenny Grossinger, who had an idea, again, partly based on European hotels and European spas. And she had a vision. She had a vision that this single family house, in which her family initially rented rooms, would grow to something larger than a boarding house, larger even than a nice sized hotel. It should grow to be sort of what everybody dreamed of when they dreamed of American luxury. Now, there are those who will hypothesize that the Catskills represent American Jews trying to become more like Christian Americans, more like white Americans, than it's certainly in the early part of the 20th century. And before that, Jews were not considered white in America. And even by the 1930s, there's this category of that includes Jews and Italians and Greeks that is starting to be referred to as white ethnics. Okay. They're not the same. But I have a problem with this hypothesis that that Jews inhabiting the Catskills are trying to become more like their, Christian upper class neighbors. On the contrary, they take some of the ideas of having these resorts with accommodations, etc., but they create an almost entirely Jewish civilization, complete with popular culture and food and references and religious services and Jewish celebrities and honorary Jewish celebrities, meaning people like Jimmy Durante, who is Italian, but what was sort of considered an honorary Jew for certain purposes. And so they really create something new. Jenny Grossinger is certainly not single-handedly, but plays a very, very big role in creating this kind of concept of an American paradise that in which Jews also can participate. Her single family house would grow to a 1,200 acre, 35 building resort, complete with its own airstrip and post office. It had its own zip code. And all you had to do if you wanted to send a letter to your relative who was spending X amount of time at Grossinger's is write, Sadie Cohen, or hopefully use a middle name because there were probably 20 Sadie Cohens that week, Grossinger's. And it would get there, or Grossinger's, New York, its own post office. It became the first resort in the world to use artificial snow for skiing, for its fake skiing hill. It became what the late, great Catskills historian, Stephen Silverman, who just passed away last summer, would call this great phrase of his. He called it Disneyland with knishes. So this is like this world. It's not exactly like anything else. It's not like the spas of Austria that upper class and upper middle class Austrian and German Jews would try to escape to in Baden, etc., or Marienbad. It's not the same resorts, even in the mountains outside New York, to which their waspier American neighbors would escape, because those didn't have the same culture. What developed at Grossinger's and the Concord and Kutsher's Hotel and Country Club, and the Nevele and Tamament and on and on and on, was really a civilization. Kutcher's was the longest running of the so-called Borscht Belt hotels. This here in this picture, as you see, is Grossinger's, the black and white one is Grossinger's in its early days as already a nice hotel. And then by the 60s, when it has multiple buildings and its own lake and its own mountain. But that wasn't enough. Having facilities was never going to be enough. Even having the mountain with snow and the ice skating rink that the Concord puts in and the glitzy dining room, that wasn't going to be enough. What else was the ingredient that the Catskills needed that really set it apart from all other areas of accommodation in the world? It had this specifically Jewish culture that was a unique combination of immigrant culture and American sort of interaction of these immigrants and their children with America, trying to make sense of it. Nowhere is that seen more profoundly than, as I mentioned before, in the birth of not only stand-up comedy, but in the whole range of entertainment that to which people either staying at these hotels or day guests, you could buy a day pass and stay for the evening, to which they were treated in the fine glitzy theaters here, the Concord Hotel Theater. Everyone you can imagine who is important in the birth of American stand-up comedy and in many other forms of entertainment had often their first jobs in the Catskills, from Mel Brooks and Sid Caesar and Woody Allen and Joan Rivers to, as I mentioned, Jimmy Durante, and on and on and on. They would all perform. They would try out routines. They would maybe bomb in one theater and fix that joke, tweak that joke, and then go sometimes later the same night and go on stage at a different theater in the area. There were also let's call it cultural borrowing from other immigrant groups that were moving into American society. Latin culture, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes with Lex, because he's an expert in the Latin dance craze that was born in the Catskills. And of course, the unlimited amount of food that was seen in these resorts. In many ways, it defined the experience for the people who were staying there. Remember, these are immigrants, children and grandchildren of immigrants. They had, or their parents had known extreme poverty. It was very, very important to them that they have as much food as they wanted, and that initially that the food be kosher. And as time went on, it was important that it at least look kosher. And this bizarre American concept known as kosher style was born and really found its full flowering in the Catskills hotels. But most of them had strictly kosher kitchens well into the late 60s and even the early 70s. And it was very, very important to, as I said, to have unlimited food. I remember when I was very little being extremely impressed at that the adults in our party would look at the menu and look and see that there was a fish and a chicken and a beef and say, you know what, bring all of them. And the most impressive thing to me was that they had, this was at the Concord, non-dairy chocolate pudding that I could eat after a meat meal. So really, Steven Silverman's phrase "Disneyland with knishes" is not far from the truth. It really was created for this population. As time went on, especially in the late 40s and into the 1950s, there was a certain subgroup among the guests who were Holocaust survivors. And there's some very sobering scholarship that's been done on the tendency of some guests who were survivors of concentration camps to hoard food, to take home, put in their bags extra rolls, etc., because they had absorbed this message that they had to, never leave food on a plate. There are all kinds of studies about that. There were several jobs that you only found in the Catskills hotels. Perhaps the most interesting of these was someone called the tumbler. The tumbler, clearly from a Yiddish word, to make a tumult, someone who makes a tumult, a disturbance. A tumbler was someone who would create a diversion and had the job, imagine Jerry Lewis on steroids. In fact, imagine exactly Jerry Lewis, because this was his job for a while. Someone whose job it was to plug in all the holes that you saw and never let any guest be bored or unhappy. So the tumbler had to wander around looking and finding a long face and then entertain that person, make up a crazy game on the spot, fall into the pool with all his clothes on, stand on his head, etc. Do anything necessary to entertain the people. One tumbler said in his memoirs, "The biggest nightmare for any of us was a rainy day." That finally convinced the owners to take out rain insurance in the form of a social director. Our job was to distract the guests so that they wouldn't notice the rain. When it rained, the tumbler had to shine. We tried to neutralize the angry mob with square dances, quiz shows, treasure hunts, ping pong tournaments, and special readings. We put on amateur shows and professional programs. We scheduled minstrel shows, concerts, champagne hours, horse race games, three-legged games, and more. We read handwriting and we read tea leaves. We ran hula contests and taught the Lindy Hop, etc., etc. And of course, what else did they do? They tried to match up every single girl and every single boy. We tried to match every boy and every girl we could find to get them out of our hair and into a romance, because if a girl finds a fella, the food is suddenly great again and the sun is shining everywhere. So this is the kind of job description that you only would find in the Concord. You have all kinds of reminiscences from people who remember being waiters or flirting with waiters, etc. You had people coming up performing from the Yiddish stage in New York, the great Boris Tomaszewski, Mickey Katz, who would sort of experience a lengthening of his life when his granddaughter, yes, for those of you who know, his granddaughter, yes, Jennifer Grey in Dirty Dancing, the daughter of Joel Grey, Joel Grey, the son of the great Mickey Katz, would play also at all the Catskills hotels. One more thing that I want to bring out, and then I'm going to ask Lex to share with us about his work, and of course about the movie that he made, his wonderful film. And actually, I'll ask him to talk about both of his wonderful films. And I alluded to this before when I talked about these immigrants not being a carbon copy, not wanting to be, not trying to be a carbon copy of their Christian relatives. They were creating something that was only in America. It was their engagement with American culture, but in a language, literally, that they understood. They were these, what I always like to call insider outsider observers. They had made it far enough into American culture to get themselves on a train or even into a private car and go up to the mountains, either staying in a bungalow colony with their compatriots or all the way up to the great hotels and the great resorts and rubbing shoulders with Danny Kaye and the like. Um, but they were creating something that didn't exist anywhere else, and that really commented on American culture, even while it was reshaping it. This is the age of the advent of television, when radio shows are moving into TV shows like Molly Goldberg and the Goldbergs. And you start to see, instead of the immigrant Jews bringing aspects of American culture with them into the mountains, you start to see things that are created in the mountains, in the Borscht Belt, filtering back down into the city and into American culture through the medium of TV, through stand-up comedy, through the spread of culture in restaurants and other forms of popular culture. And they did this by being who they were. They had contests to get the most popular cantor or liturgical singers. They had high holiday services and Passover seders at the Borscht Belt hotels. And so in the end, the generations of Jewish immigrants who created the Borscht Belt came there, and as they did with other industries, with the movie industry, with comedy, with so many other things, they found an existing tradition in America. They took from what they knew from Jewish culture and they expanded it exponentially into their own image and into the image of what they wanted America to be. A place where there wouldn't be any more signs that said no Hebrews, no blacks, no dogs. And they really, from the early part of the 20th century until almost the end of the 20th century, they really succeeded more than anyone could have imagined in their wildest dreams, and they literally moved mountains to do it. I'm going to now have the pleasure of having a conversation with Lex Gillespie, the fantastic director of the film that you watched, The Catskills, and also of an earlier film 5 years ago called The Mambo Nicks, which talks about the Latin dance craze that I mentioned. And I'll ask Lex a couple of questions about the making of the film. I happen to know something about it since I was in it with him. And then we will open it up to your questions and comments. And I hope that that you all have some questions for us. So Lex, how are you?
I'm good, good. Thank you. That was a great introduction. You really summarized things very well. And thank you very much too for the Haberman Institute for having me, and to Becky and Matt too. It's a great thing to have my film shown in as many places as I can. So this is I think this might be the smartest perhaps crowd screening that I'm having so far. I'm not sure, but maybe.
I won't tell the other ones. So where are you? Where are you joining us from?
Right now, I am in southeastern Connecticut on the Long Island Sound, about 2 hours from New York and about 2 hours from Boston. So pretty much in the middle of nowhere in New England.
So, but you're not in the Catskills.
I'm not in the Catskills. It's about 2 hours, kind of, well, maybe 3 hours west from here. And I did do that drive many times because I was going there to interview people, and so I knew all the diners now along the way.
That's always a good thing to know. So, So I'm wondering if you could share with our audience, over 90 people I see, what interested you in this subject, in making this second Catskills movie and also the first one, the Mambo Nicks? How were you introduced to the concept of the Catskills?
Well, I mean, the Catskills film really started in the Mambo Nicks because I had wanted to make a film about Latin music in the 1950s in New York. And one day, and I'm not Jewish, I'm Irish. My wife is Jewish. And one day she told me this story about her grandmother, who wanted to go to the Catskills and learn how to dance the cha-cha-cha. And her grandmother was a very nice Jewish grandmother from New Haven, Connecticut. Didn't have a lot of money in the 50s to go. So eventually she made it in towards the twilight era of the Catskills when the Grossinger's were still open in the 1980s. But I thought, wow, I had no idea what compels a Jewish grandmother wanting to have, had this long desire, kind of a bucket list thing of learning how to dance Cuban music. And I thought there's got to be a story there. And I didn't know there was this connection between Jewish culture and Latin culture that happened in New York City, really flourished in the Catskills. And so that really gave birth to my film, The Mambo Nicks, which is looking at this kind of Jewish love of Latin music and dance that started not in the Mambo era of the 50s, but back in the 1920s or so, when Cuban music was kind of sneaking in Miami Beach in particular. But it really flourished in the Catskills as evidenced by Dirty Dancing. And every hotel had to have, or the big hotels had often had an American band and a Latin band. And they would kind of, I mean, I wasn't there, but from people that I've interviewed, one band would take over and then the next band would come in, and there would be Mambo nights at the Raleigh Hotel. I believe it was Monday night. But every different hotels had, it was a big Mambo dancing scene in the Catskills. So I made this film, the Mambo Nicks, and I had filmed a lot in the Catskills, and I overshot. So I had a lot of things left over. I and it's the Catskills, you had leftovers. uh, you know, Speaking of the food. But anyway, I took the film on the film festival circuit, and everywhere I went, people had a story or wanted to tell a story about their own experiences in the Catskills. Every place I went, without fail, and even when I went to, it was the Mambo Nicks was at the cinemas that are in Bethesda when you go down the escalator to, anyway, right in downtown Bethesda. And I remember one woman was so incensed that my film only had a few minutes about the Catskills in it. This is talking about the Mambo Nicks. And at that point, I thought, wow, there's a lot of interest in this subject. There's a lot of crazy people who are crazy for the Catskills. This would make a great film. And so that's how it really started. And I had interviewed Jackie Horner, who is one of the main characters. She's the woman right at the end of the film with a padlock looking into what was once Grossinger's. So I had other interviews too, along with Nordy Hyman, who starts the film in his boat looking for his cap. So I had that material, and I just went on and just found more and more people. And I really wanted to tell, first of all, I wanted to make an entertaining film, first of all. But I also wanted it to have some kind of weight, some kind of, not only entertaining, but informative too. So I wanted to tell kind of a big story, not just focusing on the hotels and the glamour, all that kind of glitz and glamour. That, as you, Lauren, pointed out in my film, a lot of attention is paid more to the hotels than are paid to the bungalow colonies. And I love the bungalow colony story. If I could go back in time And, if I were part of the community, I would be a bungalow colony person, I think. But I wanted to have this kind of tell the full story of the Catskills. And I'm so surprised that there haven't been more documentary films made about the Catskills. Um, but anyway, so I wanted to tell a big story. I wanted to tell kind of a cradle to grave story. And I wanted to tell as much, I wanted to have as much colorful characters, obviously, as I could
You
find.
found a lot of colorful characters. They're very colorful. As I said to you before we started tonight, I was the boring one in the film.
Not true. Not true.
And you have these people who are not just reminiscing, but they still embody this. They don't just tell you about doing the cha-cha or dancing. You have your dance instructor who in your film is leading a class. People very, very proudly telling you about their not only their cooking skills, but their waiter skills. You had one person showing how he, could manage to carry 2 trays, and you see that it's still in the body language of people. And I think that you'll find this, there are certain phenomena. I think summer camp is another one where people just it's just absorbed into their bodies and they become someone else. And it also, and summer camp is another example of this as well. It also is a bond for people who don't necessarily know each other. If you know that if you meet someone who also, went to Grossinger's in the 50s or something like that, and you say, oh, were you there that summer? Oh, did you see so and so perform? And instantly there is a community made there. So you really did an amazing job of finding people who not only had this, who not only, as I said earlier about myself, are legit with the Catskills, but who really told entertaining stories. And I love the fact that I'll let you tell, sort of like how this happened, not only because you overshot, as you put it, but why did you go back to the Catskills? Not only did you have extra material, but what else was going on when you started making this?
Well, this was kind of a pandemic project, I would say, because I had gathered this material. It was just sitting there, not on the shelf, but on my, computer hard drives. And I just needed I wanted to do, but at the same time, I had really, this was pre-pandemic that I actually was doing the Mambo Nicks and had all these people come up to me after the screenings of the Mambo Nicks telling me their story of being the waiter at the Nevele. And anyway, I had started it kind of in my mind, at least before the pandemic hit. And I did some of the things like with the bungalow colony with Golden Rados, kind of during, I guess it was some of it was during the pandemic after it kind of got safe to, maintain a
Well, you
social distancing.
you interviewed me during the pandemic.
Yes, right, twice.
Right. And so just to tell our audience what a perfectionist Lex is, he interviewed me on my deck outside. Of course, nobody was going inside, and we were about 10 or 12 feet away
Social
from each
distance, yes.
other. And he was still wearing a mask. And we talked, and I think you were at my house for 4 hours by the time you set up all the stuff and did
You're
this
a great sport.
did this whole interview. And then I get this email from him that says, oh my goodness, I was driving through your neighborhood and I noticed this, what is it behind your house in the neighborhood? Some kind of club. Sure enough, there's a neighborhood pool in near my house, and it has a pool house that was built in the early 50s. And Lex said, oh my God, I have to have that as the setting. It looks so authentic. can we please do take two and do the interview again and have you sitting in next to the pool in front of the pool house? So we did. So I know just how punctilious you are with details, and you really captured it. I'm wondering if, I don't want to ask you to choose favorites, to choose any kind of, favorite characters, but who are some of the most memorable people? You mentioned some of their names before, and in particular, did people tell you any stories that you didn't use or you couldn't use for some reason in the film that you could share?
Oh, there were several stories. I mean, one that I really remember was with Steve Gold, whose family ran Golden Rados. It's not really kind of well, I guess it is a Catskills. Steve Gold, was at Woodstock, and his family, his cousins went to Woodstock. And I had read, I think it was in the foreword, I think it was an interview with him about when the 50th anniversary of Woodstock was approaching, he remembered that he had a girlfriend at another bungalow colony whose father had purchased the plywood that was part of the Woodstock stage and brought the stage to the bungalow colony and made a handball court. So I thought, that's a great story. I got to have that in my film. Didn't make it. But anyway, that was one of the big stories. And Steve then went back to the bungalow colony and found, went to the handball court, and there it was. The Woodstock stage had become this handball court. He purchased the handball court, or the wood from the plywood, and he was very meticulous about looking at the different markings that Weyerhaeuser, I'm not sure the pronunciation of the wood company that made. They had recorded the numbers that when they made the shipment in the 60s to New York to the Woodstock festival, and so he was sure that this was the actual Woodstock stage. And now he has the Woodstock stage. He's donated part of it to the Smithsonian. But anyway, that was one of the stories that I didn't tell in the story in my film. I'm thinking of making another kind of short film about that one. But anyway, that was one of the ones.
That's amazing, because that, of course, connects it with the other, sort of famous cultural event in that area, Woodstock, and that's just a different time and place, and it's really it's really sort of like the gritty parts of it, when you're talking to not just occasional guests, but when you're talking to people who and they call themselves mountain rats, and so these people who grew up there, who either were locals, who lived in Liberty, New York, or Ellensville, which I should mention, some of you may know, they're building a museum, a Borscht Belt Museum is going to open, I think, next year in Ellenville. But so the people who were from that area, who call themselves mountain rats, have this sort of behind the scenes stories. I actually have one that I learned from my family when I was doing some research. I called my uncle, George, my mother's brother, and I asked him. He had been a waiter in a couple of the hotels, and he was friends with some of the Grossinger family. And he told me, which I had not known, that my mother's and my uncle's second cousins, the Kramers, owned a Catskills hotel, not one of the large resorts, but one of the sort of mid-sized hotels. And it was large enough to have a show. They did have a stage, and they would hire these young entertainers, singers, dancers, and often you got the sense, he would say, that they were clearly trying out the material to use on the bigger stages. So apparently this person who passed away recently, the second cousin of my mother and my uncle, said that his father one summer hired this kid who said that he was funny. He hired this kid to perform and tell some jokes on the stage, and he did okay, and he worked all summer. And then one night he and the other staff members got incredibly drunk, and this kid proceeds to do a whole routine over the loudspeaker with profanity and kind of dirty stories. And some in the crowd loved it, and some were so shocked that they ended up calling the police. And the police came, and so Mr. Kramer, my mother's cousin, actually his father, says, "No more, you kid, you're never setting foot in here again." And he fires this kid. And so the kid says, "Okay, fine, blank you, I'm going to go find a job in one of the other hotels." Wouldn't you know it, he did. And this kid, Lenny Bruce, did okay doing exactly that, and using profanity and getting arrested for it and testing the limits of the First Amendment forever after. So everyone has a story. I'm going to turn to some of the comments and questions that people have typed in for us. Some people would like to know why there are no references in the movie to certain musical stars and certain cultural sort of cultural touchstones like Theodore Bikel and other musical stars. And why did you, Lex, and then I was thinking of doing this, but why did we not talk, of course, about Marjorie Morningstar, Herman Wouk's famous novel that a lot of it takes place in a Catskills hotel, and way predates Dirty Dancing. So did you think about those?
Oh, absolutely. And I read the book before I made the film, but there's just so much space. I
Right.
mean, there's lots of stories, as I said. I'm surprised there aren't more films done about the Catskills, and there's lots of things like ways I could have gone with the film. It's just we would still be watching it if I had if I had a lot more elements in it. So there wasn't any, I think that, and I'm fascinated by the earlier time, like the Marjorie Morningstar kind of the whole theater scene. Could be another documentary onto itself, I think, because from what I understand,
Right.
a
That
lot
takes
of
place in
these,
the 40s.
right. So, and even from reading, I forget which book it was. Maybe it was the Stephen. Well, anyway, there's a story of these, and I believe it's Grossingers. They would have people go to New York City and go to plays and sit in the audience and write down the lines, and then they would come up and produce the plays in the
Yes.
Catskills during the summer. And it was a big, I mean, I looked up these articles in Variety of, New York theater owners trying to stop the Catskills from putting all these, I don't know if they were Broadway productions or not, or, they're just off-Broadway productions, but the theater scene was a big,
Right.
I mean, but something like that, when you're doing a film, that would be much better for a book, because there really aren't, there certainly is not any films there's no film that would exist of this kind of scenes in the 1920s,
Right.
at least that I'm aware of.
Right.
So, and a lot of times, when you make a documentary, what happens is, the stories that you tell are really dictated by by the footage that you have, by the archival footage that you have. So, the stories that I didn't tell really because I didn't have the footage.
It's
And
right,
so,
right. You have to represent it visually, and
yes, exactly,
yeah,
exactly.
someone because along those lines, someone asked a great question about how we talk about the entertainers who congregated there and got their start there. Bill Halpern would like to know, are there examples of writers, filmmakers, and other more literary professionals who emerged from this world?
Oh, I mean, I think that whole theater scene was really part of that. But yes, absolutely. I can't think of people coming to mind right now. But I know also during the time of the blacklisting, there
Mhm.
were people who had been accused, I know that at the time, well, now people looking back realize there was a certain kind of an anti-Semitism aspect to it too, of people who had been accused of being communists back, and I'm sure Lauren, you're very aware of this
Right,
of this too, who found a
right.
home in the Catskills.
And actually, if you watch the movie, it's really, I mean, it's listed as a comedy, but it's pretty tragic. The movie The Front, Woody Allen made a movie called The Front, which he's a main character, but this really ultimately tragic character of the sort of the funny man played by Zero Mostel is blacklisted. And of course, this is art imitating life because Zero Mostel was blacklisted. And it is, and it portrays him trying to get work in the Catskills, and most of the theater owners who are scared to give him jobs. So there were some who were brave enough to do it, but it filtered in even there. Absolutely. We got a couple of questions about the presence or lack thereof of other races, ethnicities, nationalities as guests and these establishments. When, if ever, I mean, yes, ever, when did non-Jews in large numbers, and especially when did African Americans start to show up in these hotels?
Um, Well, I certainly know, Jackie Robinson, for example. I mean, I think there were African American entertainers who would stay at the hotels. There were African American sports stars who would be at the hotels. I'm not sure, and I didn't really look into this too much. So, but I don't think that there were just average paying guests who would be an African American family who would, I mean, not because they wouldn't be accepted, but it's just because it wouldn't be in the course of, I mean, it wouldn't enter their thinking to go there. I know the
Or the
Catskills,
thinking of other ethnic groups as well. It was
yeah,
extremely Jewish.
right, right.
Until I would say the few big hotels and resorts that survived into the 80s and early 90s, like the Concord, there were sort of like large groups who would have, for instance, conferences there.
Mhm, right.
But my family, I remember once went to one of the hotels, not a famous one, and there was a whole conference of Bangladeshi citizens. They were having some conference there. But yeah, it was still it was different groups perhaps went elsewhere. So as you say, it wasn't that they were restricted, but there weren't a lot of people of other ethnicities there. You have this great story though about Will Chamberlain working as a bellhop and being able to reach up and put people's satchels, as they would call them, in through, almost a second floor window. Several people are writing in lovely memories, remembering Ellen Ollendorf says, I remember being as a child, being taken by boat on a day trip in the area. Marcia Rosen remembers being a hostess in the 3,000 person Concord dining room in the mid-60s. And several people wrote, somebody named Sarah loves the film. And it says it brought back many lovely memories of going to the Catskills as a young girl with her family in the 50s, first to small hotels, then as a teen, and this is what we were saying, sort of like moving up in the ranks. Then as a teen, going with friends to the larger, more famous ones. And this is where her love for Latin music began and learning how to do all the related ballroom dances. So she would like to know, Lex, where she can find your film, The Mambo Nicks.
Well, I was it really lived on the film festival circuit, and I'm sorry to say that due to the immense cost of licensing all the music in the film, I wasn't able to actually find a distributor to put it on the internet to be seen streaming or whatnot. So unfortunately, it lived on the festival circuit, I would say
Would
that.
libraries have access to it?
I know that I've given it to a couple libraries. So yes, that's potential. That's a possibility. I'm not sure in the DC area. I don't think in the DC area that happened though. But anyway.
Oh, well, we have to change that.
Yeah.
I often can request films from my university libraries. A couple of people would like to know what you're working on now.
Oh, well, great. Thank you for asking. So I had also before the pandemic, I started working on a film, really not a Jewish themed film, but the story of Django Reinhardt, who was a Roma, a French Roma guitarist, who created this own style of jazz that is pejoratively called gypsy jazz, back in Paris in the 1930s. So I had gone to Paris before the pandemic and was filming an American musician looking for Django, really. So my film is about, and it's also about the French love of jazz, which is, people in France fell in love with American jazz just as we did, right in the very beginning times of jazz, starting with an African American World War I band led by someone named Europe, James Reese Europe, who brought jazz to Paris and jazz to France during World War I. So my film is about Django Reinhardt and jazz and swing jazz. And I don't know if you're a fan, if anyone's a fan of Saturday Night, the big band broadcast on WAMU, but that's the same kind of style of swing
all the
music.
time. Yes, yes. The big broadcast.
Oh, wait, is it?
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
yes, right. Well, I know, you know what I mean. You know what I'm talking about.
Right. Those are great projects. Art Hessel would like us to know that growing up in the Midwest, and see you, Art. Art is from St. Louis, I believe. He never heard of the Catskills. Jewish boy, never heard of the Catskills. So he would like to know how much of the crowd there was made up of New Yorkers.
Well, I mean, it's hard to put a number on that, but I would say the vast majority. But still, I know of people, of hearing people coming from Chicago and other parts of, from Boston and New England. But I think it was very much a New York, a New York kind of clientele, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that, for instance, my family, my parents were both born in Brooklyn, grew up in Brooklyn, but they had, especially my father had cousins in the Midwest. in Dayton, Ohio, and Michigan. And so because of that, those Midwestern cousins would sometimes come. And I'm sure, like you were saying, Chicago people, everybody had relatives in New York. So I think that that certainly in the 40s and 50s, I think this had begun to change by the 60s, but people who were there who didn't themselves live in New York often had a New York connection. Definitely. But the other thing that's interesting that I learned from Midwestern Jewish communities is that there was no other Borscht Belt. There was nothing in the world like the Borscht Belt, but there were other vacation areas. I forget. I'm sorry, Midwesterners, but I forget what it's called. But there was a specifically Jewish hotel area in Michigan that everybody went to before they started going to the Upper Peninsula, etc. And so, and the other thing I would say is that by the 50s and certainly by the 60s, I mentioned the advent of jumbo jet travel, etc. You start seeing the rise of other American vacation locales like Los Angeles and Miami and then Las Vegas. And what is maybe not surprising is that these places that are more accessible to New Yorkers and people in Chicago as people are flying more are themselves built up largely by Jews, by these children of immigrant Jews. So it's sort of the next chapter, and you start to see some of the very same entertainers, etc., showing up in Miami at the Fontainebleau, and certainly showing up in and career-wise in LA, but also on the stages of Las Vegas. So you have all of these different kind of iterations and generations of it that we see not only in American popular culture, but also in the sort of branching out of vacation spots in America, and they really have the same lineage. They can trace themselves back. So Lex, I throw that in your lap. You have a whole bunch of projects now that you can do, right? You can go to LA, go to Vegas. Careful there, though.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think about the legacy kind of thing, and I suppose Vegas is one part of it. And one story that I didn't cover in my film was really about Miami Beach. And because so many of the hotels that were operating in the Catskills during the summer opened up their counterparts right in Miami Beach in a similar way because of there were restrictions on certain, I forget which street it is in Miami Beach, but if you were Jewish and you wanted to own a business, it had to be below this one street, which ended up being the reason why so many resorts, so many hotels were in what is now South Beach, very prime location, was a very Jewish location back then. And Grossinger's had a hotel. I know the White Row had a counterpart. A lot of these hotels in the Catskills really launched Miami Beach. So that is one sort of big legacy
there's
that
a
people
direct
don't kind of
line
know
there.
about, but yeah.
Right. So we do have a couple more questions and comments, but we are going to need to wrap things up. I'll just try to answer. There were a couple of questions about some of the sort of the historical context, and also about the recent resurgence of the popularity of the Catskills, in particular, as this person writes, for Hasidic communities, and that is certainly true. But I'll also add to that Yiddish speaking, definitely not Hasidic community, very secular communities that are going there for conferences and such. So, maybe there is maybe there is a future. There already certainly is. There's so much nostalgia. As I said, this museum is opening next year. I thank you, Lex, for giving me the opportunity to talk with you about this, and also, of course, to work with you on the film. It was such a great honor, so much fun.
Well, thank you. You really you added a lot to it. I know you had a lot of stories that you told me that we'll figure out some other way.
Right. And I'm going to turn things over to Matt Silverman to close things out.
I just want to thank both of you once again, Lex and Professor Strauss, for sharing your expertise and all these fascinating stories. I'm sure it was wonderful for so many of our audience members and those who viewed the film, and maybe they'll watch this recording to learn and reminisce about this history. I didn't have a direct connection, but I learned so much myself. So I really appreciate that. So, and thank you to all of you out there for being a part of this engaging session. Remember to stay connected to us with our website and e-blasts, and we look forward to seeing you online again very soon. So take care and have a great rest of your day.
Stay safe.